Hey,
Hello,
everybody.
Nate.
Hello, Greg. Welcome once again to the ABA's live What's This Bird program. I am Nate Swick. I am the digital communications manager for the American Birding Association, and I host the American Birding podcast and do the social media, well, part of the social media team, really, alongside my colleague, Greg Neise, who is the web czar webmaster of the American Birding Association. And what we do here, for those of you who are hanging on or joining us as we continue to go, is we'll take your birding ID questions, take your bird questions, just leave them in the comments. We'll be happy to get to them. This is associated with the What's This Bird Facebook group. If you're not familiar with that group, it is essentially a crowdsourced bird identification community. People post photos in the group, they get their birds identified. But frequently, what we see, Greg, is a lot of similar birds at certain times of year. We can kind of run the calendar by the birds that we see. And we're going to take the opportunity here, to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that we're seeing, some interesting identification challenges, and of course, take your questions as we go. I noticed we have a few people watching already. We're going to kind of vamp a little bit while we wait for some more people to join us. But if you would let us know in the comments if you're here. Facebook, in their infinite wisdom, has sort of changed the way that live videos have gone out, and so we're learning as we go, as we do every few months. It seems like
they have made making this broadcast happen a bit of a moving target and a weekly challenge.
Make it fun, Greg. They make it
They do.
fun.
They do. It's fun. You know, the momentary panic, like 15 minutes before we're going to go live, like
Right.
every other week, is kind of, it's kind of
Holy moly,
exhilarating.
they changed another thing. All right.
So, one of the things.
Thank you, Eric, for assuaging my worries, my anxiety.
One of the things that I would like to do is talk about some of the things that we do outside of the What's This Bird group, and sort of highlight a little bit of that. And one of the things that
Believe it or not, the American Birding Association is bigger than just Greg and I coming at you every 2 weeks.
And
it's hard to believe, right? But
and we have a whole website with all kinds of really neat stuff. And one of those things is the red arrow here is pointing to it, and that is the weekly RBA, which drops Friday morning. And the Rare Bird Alert is a neat little rundown of all of I wouldn't say all, a selection of the rare birds seen across the ABA area, a sort of a snapshot of the week. And, it's fun to just see what's going on and kind of live vicariously. And this is something that Nate puts together every week.
Yeah, and sharing rare birds has been probably the one thread that has been a part of the American Birding Association since its inception in 1969. I mean, it pretty much was an organization that was created to help people find birds and help people find rare birds, in particular desirable birds or difficult birds to find in the U.S. and Canada. And that has always been a big part of what we do at the ABA, even as we have tackled a lot of other sort of larger birding culture issues.
Yeah, and so the RBA is always there on the top right corner of our webpage, and like I said, every week it's a lot of fun just to see what's happening. So you want to dive right into the pictures here? And
yeah, before we get started too much on that, I do just want to say that this is a live birding show, for lack of a better word, and Greg and I are here to take your bird and birding questions. If you have anything that you would like answered, it can be about anything. I mean, it's hard to twist our
whoa, not
birds.
anything. It's not
anything related to birds,
right? Anything
wild
related
birds,
wild birds.
Yeah, we don't know anything about chickens or bird husbandry. So sorry about that if that's what your questions. We have gotten questions about that in the past. Yeah, so let us know wherever you're watching it. This is going live in the ABA's What's This Bird group. And I think if I did things correctly, it's going live in a couple of other ABA groups as well. The American Birding Association discussion group and an ABA Birds and Birding, which is more of a photo sharing group. If you want to join any of those groups, feel free to do so.
And welcome to the Illinois Birding Network members that are joining us as well.
Yeah, and and we're also on YouTube, the ABA's YouTube channel. You can find that at American Birding Association and on Twitter. So if you want to have announcements every time we do one of these, smash that subscribe button.
Exactly.
We need like one of those YouTube celebrity graphics there for that. Yeah, hit that subscribe button, folks, and you'll have all the bird news you can handle every other week.
Absolutely. And like Nate said, so if you have any questions or comments or something you'd like us to address, or if you just like to say hi, drop it in the comments here in Facebook. We definitely like to say hi. And
hello, Eric. Hello, Jenny. Hello, Beyond BS. Those of you who already commented.
Yeah, my comments are stuck here, it seems, but that's okay. It'll probably reload soon enough. Again, Facebook is Facebook. So with that, let's go into our first bird here.
Let's get right to it. And I will say I glanced at these earlier, and Greg, I didn't just spend a ton of time looking at them, so you're catching me a little bit off guard, for better or for worse. Maybe for better. Sometimes if I think about these things a little too much, they can get in my own head.
David Bailey, before we get into this bird that we are looking at the picture of, David Bailey asks, can we talk through first fall Connecticut warbler versus morning warbler? That's what the four-letter codes in that comment mean. And I am going to say that's going to take a little bit of preparation on my end. So I'm going to put that in our back pocket and save it for next time.
I do have a couple things you could say, and that's mostly that I don't see very many of either of these birds where I live.
Well,
yeah,
it's really hard. It's really hard to describe without an illustration. But even though they're very, very similar looking birds, they're really very different, and
they act quite different,
and they present differently, and we really need to illustrate it. So, David, we will come back to that in our next program. So we have this big flying bird. What do you think, Nate?
Well, I'm struck by the I don't know if this is an official term or anything, but I'm struck by the winginess of this bird. Like its body appears rather small compared to the length and breadth of those wings. It's a raptor. Let's just start there. It's got kind of long, broad, more or less rounded wings, relatively small head. The way that it's soaring there with its tail kind of spread out like that's a very raptor way. It gives you that. So I'm thinking primarily something like a buteo or a different sort of hawk, a buteo or eagle. Not an accipiter. An accipiter would have shorter wings, more rounded wings, and a longer tail. So this is going to be one of the larger hawk accipiter forms, accipitids, sort of in the eagle, osprey, buteo range.
So the thing I see here is as you mentioned, the overall shape and everything, and the long wings. This bird has long wings. It's white underneath, which rules out quite a number of birds. It
really does. Yeah.
It's bright white. It doesn't have, it's got a pretty standard tail pattern, which is for those kinds of birds, that kind of multi-banded tail.
Yeah, thick band at the tip and kind of smaller bands on the length.
Yeah, and the wings are dark underneath. This bird presents very kind of dark and white. But the thing that we see here is the kink in what you could call the wrists. So it's where the bend in the wing is. This bird shows this kink, and as this bird is flying around, some birds, as you see them and they're in the middle of a flap or something, you catch them in a photograph where they're just lifting their wings to flap or something. You can get this sort of a wing-shaped presentation, but this particular bird, always looks like this. It always has that kink
Exactly.
in the wings, and you can see it as it flies around. You can see it from almost every angle.
And in your Buteos and your eagles, bald and golden eagle, that leading edge of the wing is going to be straight like a ruler. Yep.
And
so that leaves it with one bird.
Yep, osprey,
fishhawk. Yeah. It's a good time to see osprey. They tend to be a relatively early migrant and tend to be a very they're highly migratory. I don't think a lot of people realize that, because we see them, they're quite common on a lot of reservoirs across the continent. Throughout in the warmer months. But a lot of these birds, they've geo-tracked them. They've put those little backpacks on them and seen where they've gone. Some of them, hop down the Caribbean islands and end up spending the winter in the Amazon. Some of them like take off from Atlantic Canada or Massachusetts and fly almost entirely over the ocean, which is really pretty remarkable, all the way down to South America, where they cruise around the Amazon basin for a while before they start coming up. I mean, they're pretty remarkable birds. Great flyers, as you can see, like the wing loading, which is a term that a lot of sort of raptor watchers use, refers to, the size of the wings to the size of the body. And osprey are just like, they're made to soar. They have a very small body, long, broad wings. And so they just look a little more frail, I guess, than like a really heavy bodied buteo or a heavy bodied bald eagle.
Unless you're a fish, and
unless you're a fish.
when they dive, they do it.
Nasty.
When they catch fish, they do it quite spectacularly. They don't just dip their feet in the water like a bald eagle. They go in face first, feet first, and plunge into the water very spectacularly. And
there's some really cool images, I'm saying, of like ospreys crashing into the water, like people taking the photo like right when they hit the water, and they've got like their head looking straight down, and they're like oriented really oddly like a U, and their feet are sticking out in front, like ready to grab the thing. It's a really a very dramatic dive. Osprey
and owls, they catch their prey kind of the same way, where osprey using their eyes and owls often mostly using their ears, but as they approach their prey, they put their feet in front of their face like this and just catch just like that. Another thing
like
about
they teach
osprey
you to catch a ball like a baseball.
Exactly.
Put your
and
glove
you wind up with the ball right in the nose.
Not that that's ever happened to me before.
Another interesting thing about osprey is that this bird was critically endangered 40, 50 years ago. And the banning of DDT has resulted in their population really coming back strong. And in 1976, my science fair project that got me to the state science fair in Illinois was about the DDT weakening eggshells in ospreys. And at that time, I had only seen one, and they were very rare. And now I see them every year flying over my house. Yeah. So a really great success story.
There's a spot near Durham, North Carolina, where I used to live, where you could go to. It's this real popular birding spot. It's like one of those boat launches, but you have a nice view of the entire lake. And there are like 3, maybe 4 osprey towers that are occupied in the summer, all like you can see from one spot. So when you think about that, how that bird was very hard to come by 40, 50 years ago, and now quite common. Great conservation success story for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Now this is a fun one.
Yeah.
This is a fun one.
Yeah. I like it. Okay.
So let's
Out
take the
west.
picture. Let's take the picture on the right here. The bird is perched on a leaf stalk. Sweet gum. Yep. That tells us right away that this is a small bird. So that and the bill shape and overall shape of this bird is going to lead us quickly to birds like warblers. And what we see here is pretty much a little gray bird with a thin bill and a bold eye ring.
You can definitely see the eye ring. Like the quality of the photos is not great, but it is. So it's pretty impressive how that eye ring stands out like it does.
Yeah, and that right away narrows it down to there's not a lot of little birds that have a big bold eye ring like that. So we're narrowed down to ruby-crowned kinglet. I think blue-gray gnatcatcher might show an eye ring like that.
They do frequently.
There's a few warblers like Connecticut warbler, even mourning warbler, although mourning wouldn't have this bold of an eye ring. But Connecticut warbler might, but there's no yellow underneath. This bird is just plain.
Same with Nashville.
Yep, Nashville would show an eye ring bold like this, but would show yellow underneath. But now we look at the second picture of the same bird, and here we have a lot of clues.
The light is a little better here.
Yeah, and we can tell right away from the tail that it is not a kinglet and it is not a gnatcatcher. So that narrows it down to the warblers. And we can also see that kind of bold white wing bar just barely showing. And all of that adds up to fall or immature plumaged chestnut-sided warbler.
Yeah, I think the location in the tree is also a really nice clue. You mentioned Connecticut warbler and mourning warbler in Nashville. Oh, Connecticut warbler in particular. I think that this bird, especially the photo on the right, really does look a bit like a Connecticut warbler, kind of gray on the breast and gray underneath the chin. But it's way up high, whereas a Connecticut warbler would most likely be quite low. And it suggests that that dark on the breast, especially when compared to the same photo of the bird on the left, is a shadow from the leaves that it's in. So it's giving you kind of a false impression of what this bird might look like. And that's with all warblers. No, go ahead. No,
I was going to say that's something we talked about last week, that during fall migration is really important to keep in mind when you're looking at birds, but particularly when you're trying to identify birds by pictures you've taken. And that is that the light is getting lower and lower every day and casting strong shadows on these birds, and causing, what you see here, the difference in appearance between these two pictures.
You see the leaves changing color pretty rapidly. Swick is a tree that changes pretty early in the fall, and all those weird kind of shades of green are going to kind of cast odd shadows and odd light situations on a lot of these birds, especially when you're taking photos that may not appear to be what the bird looked like in life. And in that way, identifying birds from photos like this can be sometimes more difficult. I think it might be easier because the bird is not moving, but in some ways it can be rather difficult just because of the photo artifacts you can get. But another thing to point out, the wing bar, as Greg said, on the bird on the right, the left rather, chestnut-sided has like a bright yellow wing bars. It's actually pretty unique among fall warblers that it has yellow wing bars rather than white. You can't really see a lot. You just more or less see like the presence of a wing bar in that left photo, and also the undertail. I am seeing sort of the wingtips underneath the tail, and it sort of suggests that the bird has this kind of interesting posture, whereas the tail kind of cocks up, which you can see in a lot of warblers, but I usually associate as a very chestnut-sided warbler posture and behavior. That's a thing that they really like to do. So when you see them kind of a little round bird with a big white eye ring bopping around in a tree like that, and its wings are down and its tail is cocked up, that's a good clue that you're looking at a chestnut-sided warbler.
Absolutely, and with a lot of birds, especially warblers, the way that they present themselves in real life, even though species can be very similar looking, like we've just discussed here, the way that they present themselves, where they are in the tree, how they behave, just kind of what they look like, can be very different. You can get, you can instantly tell apart two birds that looking at a still photo would be very difficult.
Yeah. Nashville Warbler, for instance, just to call back to a bird that we mentioned earlier, doesn't usually has a much shorter tail. It's a different genus of a warbler. It's not a Cetaphega. It's Oreophlipus. They're kind of shorter tailed, shorter winged warblers, kind of stockier, not as lanky as a lot of the Cetaphegas are. And I mean, that makes a big difference, even though that they both have kind of grayish heads and bold white eye rings.
Yep. All right, now we're going to go to Crestwood, Kentucky.
Was this photo taken recently?
It was. Fairly recently.
Yeah,
and
right.
this one, when I saw it, I did a quick double take, but really, if you spend just a few seconds looking at this bird, the clues are all there. But it's kind of a startling looking bird if you're not used to.
You would definitely do a double take for this sort of thing, because I'll just go ahead and lead into the reasons why, because this is apparently a juvenile bird, like a relatively recently fledged bird, and that's not something you would necessarily expect to see in September.
Although
most exactly, there are exceptions to every rule, but most birds have finished breeding by September, and you're not likely to see a ton of young birds, which is why if you saw something like this, you might pause for a second and say, what the heck is this? What does this look like?
Yeah, so the things, whenever we look at birds like this, we always say, well, look at the obvious things. Well, the obvious thing here is that boldly spotted breast, and the rich brown color. And
it's wild.
If you if you were to go digging in your field guide and look for a bird with a boldly spotted breast and a brown back like this, a rich brown back,
and a gray head,
you wouldn't come up with what this bird actually is.
No.
At least not to begin with. But the clues are there, and the biggest clue that we can see is right below the bigger of the two wing bars. You can see the base of the primaries are white. And that is like, okay, there's not very many birds that show that. As a matter of fact, I can only think of 3 or 4 passerines that show that white flash at the base of the primaries, and maybe 5. And only one looks kind of like this.
Yeah, just to back up just a tad to kind of put it in, context of perching birds. There are a few things that I think can get you into to narrow it down. It's got a large, plump body. It's got a fairly thick bill with a little bit of a hook there on the end. It's got a very long tail, very sturdy legs and feet. This is in the family Mimidae, so your mockingbirds, your thrashers, your catbirds, those sorts of birds.
But how do you know it's not a thrush? I mean, looking at
I think
this,
the long tail sort of narrows it down, and the wing bars. I wouldn't expect a thrush to have wing bars like that, although they do sometimes have like a little bit of a paler patch on the wings, like that you noticed. But that long tail, none of the thrushes have like a long tail like that, and it is even foreshortened a tad, because it's facing sort of away from us a little bit, but it's still much longer than I'd expect on any of the Catharus thrushes or robin, even a young robin.
So one of our moderators, Tim Kalbach, put together this little graphic showing why this is a juvenile northern mockingbird. And
that rusty brown, I think, is throwing a lot of people.
Well, the spots in the rusty brown. But the white patch in the wings, and when you look at it and you're just like, okay, it has black wings, it has a black tail with white tips. It has a gray head. This is a bird molting out of juvenile plumage.
Correct.
And all of those brown spots and stuff will be replaced, and it will look like the mockingbirds that we're all familiar with. And I'd just like to take a moment here to call out all of our fantastic moderators, the people who help us at What's This Bird, like Tim Kalbach and others. They do just a never-ending job helping people learn about the birds that they're posting there. So
absolutely.
Cheers to them.
Sort of some interesting things about this bird. I would expect a thrasher to have a much longer bill, and it would be much more rufous all over, not just on the wings.
Exactly.
It would have rufous on the head as well. Honestly, the bird that comes to mind when I look at this bird is a sage thrasher more than a brown thrasher. because sage thrasher is sort of a weird bird that's, I don't know, it's almost more closely related to the mockingbirds than the true thrashers. It's in its own genus. It's a very
Yep.
unique sort of bird, and it does vagrate to the eastern part of the continent with some regularity. It's not a super common western vagrant, but there are quite a few records. And yeah, if I were just glancing at this bird, I would think, oh boy, is that a sage thrasher?
Yep.
But it does have some of the trademarks of a juvenile bird, such as the gape, that yellow part in the around the mouth. It's much more pronounced in a young bird. This bird is an older juvenile, but it does still show the signs of the gape, and it's just so modelly and messy. It looks like a bird that's coming out of those juvenile body feathers that are not very strong. They're kind of meant to not last very long, into sturdier adult feathers. In these birds, they look like an adult after their first molt.
Yes, there's a question about how common it is for mockingbirds to look like this, and it's very common because for a very short period of time, they look like this. Every single one of them ever hatched looks like this, but they retain this plumage for a very, very short period of time. They molt quickly, and so you don't see them like this all that often, even though every single mockingbird at some point looks something like this.
Yeah.
And all the thrushes and mimidae do. They all have that spotted breast and kind of brownish look. Juvenile robins have an almost identically spotted breast.
Yeah. Susan Nelson notes, if you saw this young mocker in person, you could idea it from its mockingbird behavior and call. That is almost certainly true. I guarantee that its parents are probably not too far away. This one's still young and not too long out of the nest.
Yeah, you could probably identify it by what's attacking you as you're watching.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I was going to say, like, you would know there are mockingbirds around if you were looking at this bird. They would be loud and aggressive.
Yes, and that is, Susan points out that they are very good at hiding, and yes, they are very good at hiding when they want to. One of my most difficult birds to get on big days is northern mockingbird, because they're just so hard to find in places, even where they're relatively common. They like to skulk when they're not chasing you or displaying or being raucous. They just put themselves away and stay there.
Yeah. I once spent a good amount of time when I was still taking some graduate school classes. I took a really cool animal behavior course. This was not all that long ago, and one of the assignments was to follow a mockingbird, like watch it for 45 minutes and just like make a note of everything that it does. And so I followed one that was like just hanging out in my backyard. I just sat on my back deck and watched this mockingbird for 45 minutes and watched it kind of move around the top of every house. This was like in early June, and sing for a little while and then fly. So you could figure out exactly the boundaries of its territory just based on, whose houses it was perched on the top of singing. It was actually kind of a neat exercise if you ever get a chance to do that.
Yeah.
They're fascinating birds.
And you can, if you have American robins in your neighborhood, you can do the same thing and watch the robins and see the town next to where I live, Oak Park, is quite famous for their big lawns and beautiful neighborhoods. And there's an incredible number of robins that nest in Oak Park, Illinois. It's a study is waiting to be done on just how many robins there are. But what's neat is that the robins have very often used the streets and the alleys as the defining points of their territories. And as you walk down the block, you will find many times I've seen robins fighting in the middle of the street, because that's the line, that's the boundary of their territory.
Yeah, that's cool.
Okay,
not very safe for the robins, but
yeah. And pardon my little sniffling here. The mold count in the Chicago area is bad.
Welcome to fall.
Exactly. Okay, we're gonna move in to. Interesting. I'm just gonna say this is a hawk based on its feet.
I think that's a fair assumption there, Greg. Yeah, there's got kind of the bowling pin shape of a lot of buteos and accipiters when they're perched like this. A lot of streaks on the front, a lot of streaks on the back too. Um, but yeah, this is a buteo, even though I can't really. Well, okay, let's talk about that. So, we can't see the tail, so it's hard to
Right.
make some sort of assumption about whether this is a buteo, like a Cooper's hawk, or one of the small buteos like red-tailed. I'm sorry, like red-shouldered or broad-tailed.
Right.
The first thing that stands out to me is just the shape of the bird. It's got a very large bodied and relatively small headed. Whenever I see an accipiter perched, they're much more columnar, I guess. They're like narrower, skinnier around, especially they're not very chesty, although the sharp chin can be chesty a little bit.
And they can all fluff up. Again,
Yeah,
the photograph is just a snap
that's a good
in
point.
time. But the thing we see here is that the juvenile accipiters, they tend to be streaked. They're not
Yeah. Oh, yeah,
mottled and blotchy like this. So
sort of chevrons on this guy.
yeah, I mean, they're streaked below. They're not all messy like this. And the two species of our common species of buteo, at least in Connecticut, would be red-shouldered and broad-winged that look like this. And the key field mark here is we can see on the wing panel at the bottom of the wing where it approaches the branch. There's two bands of white, sort of looks like checkering in the secondaries, and that makes this a young red-shouldered hawk. A broad-winged hawk would just be plain dark without that white checkering. Now, someone in the comments of this photo on in the group had asked if it was a merlin, and maybe the person who took the photo was asking if it was a merlin. And as we were saying earlier, falcons and accipiters and buteos, they're falcons and buteos are related. Accipiters and buteos are related, and falcons are not. Falcons are different. And so, even though the sort of general brown modelly impression of the bird is similar, the falcon has a really different shape. It's subtle, but the bill is different. The head is square and small. It's where I'm getting at with this. Go ahead, Nate.
I would say there's something about, so when I look at these two photos, I would say, the bird on the right, the red-shouldered hawk, looks big, and the merlin looks small, right? And I realize that those are completely unuseful because you have absolutely nothing to compare them to. But when we talk about size a lot of times, and I think I've made this point before in this spot, a lot of times what we're talking about is proportion, right? So proportionally, it gives the impression that a bird is large or small. When you look at the red-shouldered hawk, well, it's got a very large body compared to its head. The head looks rather small on top of a rather large body. And so it looks big. Something about it just like translates to big in our brain. Whereas you look at this falcon and the head is much larger comparatively to the body, right? And therefore it sort of looks small, right? I think this sort of thing happens when we talk about shorebirds, like pectoral sandpiper versus least sandpiper. Pectoral sandpiper looks big because its body is big in comparison to the size of the head, whereas least sandpiper, the head looks big compared to the size of the body. Things like kinglets and warblers, they're the same way. The head looks comparative to the size of the body. This is just a theory I'm kind of throwing out there, but I think that when we talk about size, a lot of times when people say, "Oh, it's a hawk because it's big," well, what we're talking about is the way the impression, the way the proportion impresses on us, and we're just calling it big.
And we can also
talk about it in terms of proportion.
Yeah, and we can also see that
Susan Nelson would said that the feet look big on the merlin as well compared to the body.
They do.
Good point.
And we can also see that the wing panel itself. I mean, look at where the shoulders are on the Merlin. This bird has very long wings, and the shoulders come right up almost to the chin. Whereas they really don't on the red-shouldered hawk, but the head shape and just the sort of general impression. And what's interesting about falcons is that even though they look like hawks, like the bird on the right, and you think they're fairly closely related, they're really not. And falcons are actually related to parrots. They are murder parrots.
More closely related to parrots.
Well, more closely related. They're next to parrots and separated from the other hawks by quite a
large margin. Yeah,
quite a lot,
many millions of years. Yeah.
And if you see if you see like a kestrel doing, and I'm not talking about hovering, but they often fly with this sort of fluttery, shallow wing beat. And then you go to the tropics for the first time and you see parrots flying. Yeah, you'll notice right away, boy, they're really similar.
That's true. Yeah. Oh, you don't even have to go to the tropics. You can go to like Florida or Chicago.
Oh, yeah, you can go to Florida or Texas or Southern California or Hawaii or heck, I mean, even places like Chicago or New York where monk parakeets are established. But
yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah, the parrots definitely do have that very unique flight style where they flap really quickly and shallow. It is very distinct, and
if you watch falcons, you will see falcons do that.
They do a similar sort of thing. Yeah, even though they have much longer wings.
So yeah, remember that falcons are murder parrots. Okay. So this is our last picture for this show here. And we get a lot of these in the group, and we don't highlight them very often. But it's a feather that was dropped by a bird, probably molting, or who knows what. It might have been caught by a hawk or whatever. But we find feathers on the ground. We can see from the leaves here that it's not very big. I'm going to guess this feather is maybe 4 or 5 inches long at most. Yeah. So, and what do we see here? What can you tell us about this feather, Nate?
Well, that black and white pattern is very striking, and this is a wing feather, probably a secondary feather. So, if we're thinking about birds with a lot of just based on the shape, I should say.
Now we can we can back up and say it's a wing. We
know we know it's a flight feather because it is asymmetrical. So it's shorter on the one side than it is on the other side. That short side is the leading edge of the wing. So if you think of like an airplane wing, how it's kind of bulgy on the front and kind of tapers on the back, bird wings do exactly the same thing. Bird feathers, individual feathers do the same thing. So it's asymmetrical. So we know it's a flight feather. It's rounded on the end. So we know primary feathers are going to be more pointed because those are the ends, and secondaries are the ones that are kind of along the arm of the bird.
And generally longer appearing. The secondary feathers tend to be wider overall and blunter.
Yeah. So anyway, so we're kind of thinking about birds that have a very striking black and white pattern on the flight feathers, and the first thing that comes to mind are woodpeckers. There's a great many black and white woodpeckers with lots of kind of zebra stripes, things like hairy woodpecker, downy woodpecker, red-bellied woodpecker. All of those birds have kind of what you would imagine
Nuttall's
this
ladderback
pattern to be. Yeah, I'm showing my East Coast bias there, but yes, those birds as well.
But and what's kind of neat is that when you do start studying individual feathers, is not so much downy and hairy, but all the other woodpeckers that have feathers that look like this, the black and white pattern is different. And that's why, some birds appear to have black and white spots when they're resting, whereas on the back, which is actually the folded wings, is much of the back is folded wings. Some of them look spotted and some of them look striped or barred. And that's because of the pattern on the individual feathers. When they're all laid together, they form those patterns of spots or stripes or bars or whatever they have. Before
we reveal what
Yeah.
this feather comes from, Greg. I would like to make a comment to all the people watching that if you have any questions or comments or anything about birds, bird identification that you would like us to chat about, talk about, answer questions, whatever, please do so. I'm going to give you a little bit of time to think about those while we finish up with this bird, because this is the last picture. And if you want us to keep talking about birds instead of doing, the other stuff that we have to do today, if you can't tell, I'm sort of begging you to allow us to keep talking about birds rather than the other things we have to do.
Yeah.
Now's the time. So now go, please proceed.
So the one of the reasons that I picked this for today was as much to talk about this particular feather, and it is a woodpecker feather, as we've discussed, but to make people aware of the Feather Atlas, which is a phenomenal resource that is Fish and Wildlife Service. It's part of the Fish and Wildlife Service website, and the URL is down there below. You can just Google Feather Atlas and find it. But for most species of birds in the United States, they have the flight feathers and tail feathers laid out like this, so you can see.
Yeah, it's cool.
How big they are, and you can see, so what we're looking at here are the secondary wing feathers. So those are not the primaries, which are the ones that look like fingers on a flying bird, but they're the inside of the wing, the closer to the body. And going from left to right are the closest to the primaries and then closest to the body. So actually, we could, by looking at this, we could tell exactly which feather this was from a red-bellied woodpecker. And they also show adults, males, females, juveniles. And if there's a difference there, you could you'd find out that this is from a juvenile red-bellied woodpecker.
Yeah, I see a lot of this sort of feather. Red-bellied woodpecker is a very common species where I live. And I'll be honest, I frequently identify them as like a downy or a hairy. This has opened my mind to the possible. I don't know why I didn't think there wouldn't be red-bellied woodpecker feathers around. There's more red-bellied woodpeckers than any other kind of woodpecker in my neighborhood. So you'll figure.
Yeah, so that is it for the birds, and at least for the photos. And we can keep talking about birds here if you guys want to. So if you've got something, I will say that further up I saw a comment about young gulls and asking to talk about herring and lesser black-backed. That is like the warbler pair we discussed earlier. Another one that's best done with illustration. I mean, we could sit here and talk about it until we're blue in the face.
Try to describe it.
Yeah, and you'd come away just going, yeah, I'm just not even going to bother. But I think if we could put together some illustrations, so we'll hide that one away for another time.
We tend to do gull stuff in the winter months when gulls start popping up on What's This Bird, because people are tired of looking at everything else and they want to start looking at gulls. But yeah, herring and lesser blackback is a great one. They're very closely related birds. I live in North Carolina, and they are both rather common. Lesser blackback increasingly so on the coast of North Carolina, down on the Outer Banks. There's some beaches in the northern Outer Banks near Kitty Hawk and Nag's Head that there are more lesser blackbacks than herring gulls. They're one of the probably the third most common gull that you'll see on the beaches after great blackback and laughing. So, which is pretty amazing to think about. 10 years ago. Yeah,
that is a species that has exploded. So Susan Nelson asks, says she's noticed that some birds in her area, Western Tennessee, appear to migrate very short distances after breeding season is over. Are there studies about super short migrants? Well, my first question to you is, how do you know?
Yeah.
How do you know that the birds you're seeing are going a long distance or a short distance? And the more we learn about how birds migrate by putting, as we were talking about earlier with the little backpacks so that we can track them, we find that they're doing things that we didn't think they did before. And one example that comes to mind is I remember years ago being at a park and that had some pine trees, and people had found white-winged crossbills in these pine trees, and that's a pretty rare bird from where I'm at. And a bunch of birders went up there to see it, and there were two groups of pine trees, and these birds kept going back and forth between the two of them, but would sometimes fly off and then apparently come back. Mm-hmm. By sitting there watching, we discovered what we were looking at was not one group of 8 to 15 crossbills moving back and forth, but we were watching a flight, and every single group of 8 to 10 crossbills was a new group passing through. And the one that we saw at 10 o'clock in the morning was long gone, and the one that we just saw fly in was a brand new set of birds. And a lot of birds, you think that they're the ones that you've had around all season. Well, they might not be at all.
Yeah, a great example of that, if I may do a bit of self-promotion. If you want to go back to an episode of the American Birding Podcast, which is the ABA's podcast that I host, of ABA's weekly podcast that I host, that came out a couple weeks ago with Emily Williams, who is a researcher who's doing work with American robins. And American robins are one of those birds that people seem to see all year round. And so a lot of times they will just assume that the birds that they see in the spring are the birds that they're seeing in the fall, in February, that are the same ones breeding in their yards in July. And that turns out not to be the case, or at least not always the case.
Yep.
Because robins are incredibly plastic in their migratory abilities. There are birds that breed in Denali National Park in Alaska that are migrating to massive robin roosts in the south central part of the country, places like Texas and Missouri and Arkansas and Oklahoma. And those migrations are many thousands of miles and are in fact akin to the migrations of things that we associate as very long distance migrants. For instance, things like chestnut-sided warbler or American redstart, or things that migrate to middle America every winter. But on the other hand, there are robins, and Emily points out that birds that she had tagged and tracked in Indianapolis, in Indiana, some of them go to these places. Some of them hang around central Indiana for the entire winter. Yep. Some of them hang around an individual neighborhood for the entire winter. So it's a giant mix. And
it is.
And Susan, I think that birds migrate more than we give them credit for. Things like goldfinches and cardinals and things like that probably migrate a little bit. But there, in some ways, there's no way to know.
And well, Susan then says Canada geese. So a little experience I had a few years ago here outside in the forest preserves outside Chicago was a flock of Canada geese, and about 6 or 7 of them had neck bands. So I recorded all the numbers on the neck bands and reported them to Fish and Wildlife. And it turns out that maybe 4 of the 6 were from about 15 miles away and were hatched 4 or 5 years before I saw them, and were part of a study to see primarily how Canada geese were using an urban area, golf courses and stuff in the suburbs. But 2 of them were from northern Ontario.
Yeah, right.
And were hanging out with the flock that was hanging out locally.
Yeah, it's really interesting because birders are very attuned to like a cackling goose or a Ross's goose or a snow goose that turns up in those kind of local Canada goose flocks. But we don't always think about the fact that the Canada geese that are in those local flocks could be as far afield as those more unusual species.
As the high Arctic, they nest all the way up there.
Yeah, David Bailey has a really interesting question. He notes, this is on Facebook, by the way. Mm-hmm. He notes that I recently moved from Colorado to Kentucky, and the birding is, of course, different. Since we're both Eastern birders, you are an Eastern birder, though you might say you're a Midwestern birder, Greg. Do you bird differently for fall migration than spring migration? If so, what are those differences? That's a neat question, and absolutely. Spring migration is very much getting out in certain kinds of habitat and trying to see as many species that might be associated with those habitats as I can. Fall migration for me is, so there's 2 things. that you're searching for, and that is food. So things like fruiting trees like dogwoods and hawthorns and redbuds and things like that are amazing places to go look for birds. And the other thing is warmth, especially as we're coming into kind of the colder part of the fall, where the nights actually get quite cold and the mornings can be quite cold. I don't often look for certain habitats as much as I look for the first places that the sun hits when I'm birding in the fall. So if I have an opportunity to go down a row of trees and one is going to be in shade, even if the habitat looks better, and one is going to be in sun earlier, I'm going to always take the one that's going to be in sun, because as soon as the sun hits those trees, those bugs are going to start waking up. They're going to start moving around, and the birds are going to be there. So if you're going out birding in fall, especially after a particularly chilly evening, that first morning, look for where the trees where the sun hits the first, and that's where all that bird activity is going to be. And that's probably a clue for west as well, but that's something.
And just for what it's worth, that holds true in the spring too. After a cold night, sun, as soon as the sun hits the treetops and the bugs become active, that's where the warblers are going to be.
Well, we got summer temperatures by the middle of March down here. So.
Oh yeah, no, I've been in the 40s on May 15th.
Yeah.
And in terms of weather, in the springtime, birds move in waves, and you're looking for what you might think of as a perfect setup for spring migration, which is a big southerly push that maybe if you're really lucky hits a cold front coming in and stops the bird and stops the bird movement. You want to be birding right where that happens, because that's where the birds are going to drop out of the sky in the night when they hit that cold front. And you're looking for things like that. In the fall, we tend to look for weather like we've just had in the last few days across much of the eastern part of the country. I think the storm that hit Chicago 3 days ago is now in New York. And it's really fun watching the reports from Lake Michigan and actually all the way into Iowa, all the way across to the Atlantic. Everybody's seeing Jaegers. It's like this was a Jaeger front. Everybody from the reservoirs out, west of the Mississippi, all the way now into upstate New York and east are seeing Jaegers on lakes and rivers, and so we associate in the fall these first cold fronts with movements of birds like that, gulls and Jaegers and shorebirds and things like that.
Yeah, I'll tell you, typically, and obviously there are differences based on exactly where you might be on the continent, but 2 to 3 days after a big cold front moves through where I live, that seems to be the peak, because you've got a few days for them for the birds really to be moving. So it's not immediately after that cold front moves through. It's usually a couple nights afterwards. That's when things really start to happen. Fall migration, just in general, is so much more leisurely. The birds are going to stick around if there's good food for them there. They're not going to, they're not driven by hormones to get to their breeding territories as fast as possible like they are in the spring. They linger. And so you have a much better opportunity to kind of, that kind of protracted migration. It's less of a wave and more of just a steady drip, 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 drip of constant movement. But there are kind of mini waves after cold fronts move through.
And another thing is a hawk migration. And hawk migration is really, good days are generated by good winds. And each location where you might do a hawk watch has its own specific ideal setup. So you learn in your local area where your hawk watching places are, and then you learn okay, this one's really good on a strong west wind, this one's really good on a strong north wind, and then watch the wind forecast, and then go to those places when the hawk during September, October, and early November to watch.
I mean, there are some people out there in the birding community who are so good at sort of interpreting that stuff, and that it can feel like magic. I've had friends say after a cold front, you look at the eBird charts and you see, oh, this is the peak of Franklin's Goal southbound migration, and we just had this strong push out of west wind, this sustained 3 days of west wind. I'm going to go out tomorrow morning and see if I can find a Franklin's Goal in a reservoir, and yeah, there they are. Like it's wild stuff, but it's important to know, it's a skill, and you put your mind to it and you start to draw these conclusions based on the data that you're given. And there's so much data these days. I mean, there's just so much information out there. I do think we're sort of in a golden age for birding. You can become a skilled birder in less time than perhaps you ever could have before, just if you are good at reading the data and put your mind to it. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, and I'll give you an example. In when I started birding a long time ago, bringing back up Jaegers again, Jaegers on Lake Michigan you looked for them in November in the worst weather, and that was basically it. That was the right. that was the accepted knowledge, is that you went out in the worst weather in November to look for Jaegers. We've since discovered that long-tailed Jaegers in particular are moving in August, and actually the end of August and early September is the best time to see those birds, along with Sabin's gulls. And you get that first big northerly push, especially where I'm at, if there's a northeasterly component to the wind, and you go out to some of the places along the Indiana lakeshore, you're pretty much guaranteed to find Jaegers and maybe Sabin's gulls and shorebirds and ducks and things moving along the lakefront. The next day it'll be totally calm. Those birds are there, but you're not going to see them.
Yeah, that Jaeger information is just so amazing to me, because I have seen migrating Jaegers offshore in North Carolina in like late May, early June. Like they're still going north. And to think that they're coming south again in July.
Yeah.
Like they spend practically no time on the breeding ground. They get busy, get the chicks out, and are gone.
Yep.
That's pretty wild to me.
Yep, they just go up there, eat a few leaf sandpipers, and then turn around and come back.
Yeah, it's crazy stuff.
All right, another question here. Any good field guides to start reading for ready reference in the field? Well, boy, there's a discussion.
Yeah, we could do a whole hour on that.
My favorite reference guide is the big Sibley Guide to Birds, which covers the entire ABA area. I just think if you're going to have one book to dive into, for me, that's the one.
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't disagree with that. The field guides, it's like asking people like what their favorite food is or what their favorite music is. I mean, there's a lot of what works for you and what do you prefer. I think Sibley has cast the widest net in terms of appeal to novice birders and expert birders for sure. But there's a lot of good stuff out there. I really like the National Geographic field guides. Just because they've got a ton of really good information. I think that the Stokes field guide is just really dense with information too. And also as a photo field guide, if you prefer photo field guides, it's very good. I mean, there's a lot of really good stuff out there. If you're a novice, I might suggest the ABA series of field guides to various states. I actually wrote the one for the Carolinas. I probably have a copy of one. No, they're probably in a box in my car.
There's one. The Illinois one is back there on my shelf.
I see it back there.
By Michael Redder, who's one of our colleagues.
Those are really great because they are just like a guide to the most likely 325 odd birds that you're likely to see in a given year in the states that they feature. They're all written by local experts, local people who know not only how to identify the bird, but perhaps more importantly, exactly where you can find those birds. That kind of local gen, that local knowledge is just invaluable. And how, as I think all birders know. A lot of insight into. As
Nate said, how to bird your state, what's the deal in your state? Because, as we
exactly
as we talk here, Nate's in North Carolina, I'm in Illinois, and, the way we approach birding is very different because we live in
there's a lot of similarities, but there's a lot of stuff.
Even though we see a lot of the same birds.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. And every state is different. Every state has their own little favorite places, their own little secret hot spots that if you've been birding there long enough, about. But if you're a relative novice, you might not know about.
Well,
It's
and
not
bigger
like
things like you have mountains. And
oh, yeah, that's true.
elevation
Yeah, that does help.
elevation does
Yeah,
things that it
and an
changes.
ocean.
It's a and an ocean, and those are two things that really change the dynamic.
Yeah, yeah. And what I love about that sort of local knowledge is that it's not like this stuff is necessarily secret, but some of it just doesn't get passed to people just because they don't know. Like, you don't know what you don't know, right? So if you have an opportunity to get to that stuff and learn from that stuff, that's always super super useful.
And even if you have been birding for a while, the ABA field guides, the ABA state field guides, have a lot of really useful information. Even if even if you've been doing it for a couple of years or more.
Oh, for sure. I think that the best answer, Vyam, to your question is all of them, all of the field guides. You need all of the field guides.
Yeah, those are all. Let's see, I was leading this way. Those are all bird books back there.
Yeah, I have. Yeah, you can't see it, but I got a bunch too. I think birders like to collect things. It's part of the reason why we like birding and why we like listing. What is a list if not just a collection of sightings? And field guides are no different.
Absolutely. And we have just ticked the 1 hour mark, which is kind of our witching hour here. But before we go, I would like to say that if you enjoy what we do here and you enjoy these programs and the What's This Bird group and the things on our website, please support us. Become a member of the American Birding Association. You can be a full member for $30 a year, which is $2.50 a month. I mean, it's a cup of coffee at Dunkin' Donuts once a month.
That much. You spend that much on Amazon. Come on.
Tolls, And so right up here, hit that, go to aba.org/join and be part of the club and help us keep doing what we do, because we love sharing. What's that?
I always get it wrong. I gotta remember it's over my left shoulder.
It's right there.
Left.
So Sharon asked before we go, do I have any good Southwest suburb locations in Chicago? I will post something in the Illinois Birding Network right when we're done here, a link for a birding map that we've got that you can reference, Sharon. So look for that in the next 5 minutes or so.
Otherwise, join the ABA, check out our free resources. We have a lot of cool stuff. Thank you for being a participant in the What's This Bird group or whatever ABA group you're in. We definitely enjoy those communities. Subscribe to the American Birding Podcast, leave a rating review there. We got a lot of cool stuff at the ABA. Go to aba.org and learn all about it. With that in mind, we'll see you next in 2 weeks. We promise we'll talk about Connecticut warblers and mourning warblers. Then Greg will he'll get all prepared.
I will be all
Thank
prepared.
you to everybody. And